By the mid-1970s, CIA analysts had concluded that the Soviet economy had grown to somewhere between 55 and 60% of the size of the United States economy, an economic giant, second only to America and closing the gap. That estimate, refined and republished year after year by the CIA's Office of Soviet Analysis, became a working assumption behind 4 decades of American defense budgets, arms control negotiations, and Cold War strategy. It was also, according to a growing body of later research, probably wrong, not fabricated, but built on a methodology that struggled to translate a command economy's internal accounting into anything comparable to a market economy's GDP. When the Soviet Union actually collapsed in 1991, the real economic conditions that emerged did not look like a country that had been running at 3/5 of American output. This is the story of how the CIA built its Soviet GDP number, why economists still argue about how wrong it was, and what that means for every dataset on this channel starting its clock in 1991. The CIA's estimates came out of a discipline sometimes called Sovietology, and within the agency, the Office of Soviet Analysis, which spent decades building physical output indicators for the Soviet economy. Tons of steel, barrels of oil, units of machinery, tractors, cement. Because the Soviet Union never published a market-based GDP figure, and the ruble was not convertible at any market rate, analysts needed a method to translate ruble-denominated output into dollar terms. Their solution was a set of ruble-to-dollar price ratios, applied industry by industry, meant to approximate what Soviet goods would cost priced the way American goods were. A 1991 review by the US Government Accountability Office found a specific flaw. The CIA had not meaningfully updated those ratios since the 1970s, even as the Soviet economy's composition shifted underneath them. The deeper problem was structural. Soviet prices were set by planners, not discovered through exchange. They did not register scarcity and did not discount for defects. A tractor that broke down in 6 months and one that ran for 10 years carried the same official price and contribution to output. Military hardware, unsellable consumer goods, and equipment nobody wanted were all counted at full ruble value, whether or not any of it created value a market would actually pay for. The test came in 1991 and 1992, when the Soviet Union dissolved and its successor states, Russia first, under a program of rapid price liberalization launched in January 1992, let real prices replace administered ones almost overnight. What followed was not a modest adjustment. Russia's measured GDP fell roughly 45% between 1989 and 1998. Ukraine's economy contracted closer to 60% over a similar span, a decline that stretched out for nearly a decade. Across the former Soviet Union as a whole, output fell an estimated 50% from its 1989 peak. In several republics hit by war on top of the price shock, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Tajikistan, GDP by 2000 stood at only 30 to 50% of pre-transition levels. For comparison, the formerly communist states of Eastern Europe made the same shift from planned to market pricing and lost 20 to 30% of output over 2 to 4 years, a real recession, but shallower and shorter. The scale of the Soviet collapse struck many economists as difficult to reconcile with a starting point of 55 to 60% of American GDP. An economy that large should not have produced contractions this deep across so many republics at once. The mismatch between the pre-1991 estimate and the post-1991 data became the first hard evidence the CIA's number had measured something other than real output. The reassessment actually started before the collapse. In July 1990, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan told a Senate hearing that CIA estimates had overstated Soviet output for a generation and distorted American defense policy, arguing the real figure was closer to a third of US GDP, not half. A CIA official, George Kolt, conceded the agency's numbers were most likely on the high side. The GAO's own 1991 review agreed the CIA had probably overstated the Soviet economy's relative size, while cautioning that claims of a 3- or 4-fold overestimate went further than the evidence supported. Angus Maddison, the economic historian whose historical GDP database remains a standard academic reference, calculated independently that the Soviet economy peaked around 1975 at roughly 45% of US output, meaningfully below the CIA's own figure of about 58% for that year. Not every economist agreed the CIA had simply been too generous. Stephen Rosefielde argued the opposite on a specific point. Applied to West Germany and the United States as a test, the CIA's own growth methodology understated their known growth rates too. Evidence, he argued, that the approach was unreliable in more than one direction, not simply inflationary toward Moscow. Anders Åslund and other transition economists pointed to a deeper problem beneath the price conversion debate. Once real prices were applied after 1991, large parts of Soviet heavy industry turned out to be subtracting value, consuming inputs worth more, at world prices, than the finished goods were worth. No fully settled consensus exists today on how large the Soviet economy really was relative to the United States at any point in the Cold War. What exists instead is a range. CIA-era estimates near the high end, Maddison's independent calculations meaningfully lower, and a literature, Rosefielde, Åslund, and others, that agrees the official number was probably wrong without agreeing on the direction or size of the error. That unresolved debate matters beyond Cold War history. Every video on this channel tracking a former Soviet republic's trajectory starts its chart in 1991, using pre-1991 GDP figures reconstructed, often years later, from this same contested data. Treat any number on this channel from before 1991 as an informed estimate within a range, not precise data carried to a decimal point. Post-1991 figures, built on market prices and audited statistical methods, are far more reliable, and that distinction is the foundation underneath every chart that follows. Subscribe to the Collapse Index. New data every week.